The first time I met you, we were with John Maxwell. We were in West Palm Beach, and you got up and you told a story. And I remember telling Darnell Self, this gentleman knows how to tell a story. Like, you had me glued to my seat just like you did earlier to everyone else that was here. And I wanted to spend some time with you and maybe just interview you a little bit and get some questions that I've got answered, if that's okay with you.
I'm on. Let's do it.
Awesome. So, we talked about your background, and the intro kind of talks about, all these sports figures, and obviously you spent a great career with Sports Illustrated and reached some of the highest ranks as a writer and editor with Sports Illustrated. Yeah. So what took you from wanting to be with Sports Illustrated and telling all those great stories to say, I want to start my own company focused around greatness and great achievers and how I can help others in all industries achieve that kind of greatness?
Don, as I mentioned earlier, the one thing that really kind of was a game changer for me was that I started asking great winners the question, like, what allows you to separate yourself from other people? Now, the root of that, which is so great to be able to discuss here in our one-on-one, is that I had my father. My father was a preacher, a Methodist preacher, and when I was graduating from college, I'm heading to my first job, my first newspaper job, and before, as the car's loaded up and I'm getting ready to drive, my dad grabs me and we're standing there in the gravel driveway, and he says, Don, I know that because of your profession that you've chosen, journalism, you're going to end up in the presence of some really extraordinary people. Now, you're going to ask them the questions you need to ask them for your audience, your readers. He said, but you should always ask every great person you get a chance to encounter one question, and that's something that will benefit you, whatever that one question might be. And I settled in on that question of, if you could tell me what's a habit you developed that allowed you to separate yourself from others. If you could share anything that made you just a little bit closer to best in class, what would the habit be? And then I kept a list of all these habits and the answers from all these great winners. And when I retired from Sports Illustrated, early retirement, I sat down with all the answers and started charting a list to say, here's how the great ones got there. And when I realized I had that, which was kind of unique content, only lucky enough to have it because of the career I'd chosen, I realized that if I could share it well, if I could learn how to take what I loved doing as a writer and turn it into a stage presence, that I might have a future in this space as well.
Oh, that's amazing. In our time talking, one of the things that happened at the John Maxwell event is you and I got a chance to sit next to each other for dinner, and that's where we really got a chance to know each other a few years ago at that dinner. But you were telling me an incredible story, really. I mean, I had no idea until you were telling me that you actually had a chance, you were invited to live with Walter Payton the last few weeks of his life.
Last 10 weeks of his life, yeah.
One of the greatest athletes of all time. I mean, arguably the great, and for many, not even arguably, the greatest running back of all time in the NFL. But what was that time? Because, I mean, that's a unique experience. What was that time? What did you take away from that?
Well, first off, I mean, it was completely happenstance. I'd met Walter previously, knew him a little bit, but I did not know that he was dying. I mean, he knew it, but to the world, he was sick. He knew it was past sick and he was dying. He decided to write a book, decided to look for a writer. I happened to be on Oprah during that window of time. Walter loved watching Oprah. And so he saw me, and that gave him a reason to reach out and ask, would I come do this? Would I come write his book with him? Obviously, Walter Payton opens a door like that. You run as fast as you can, right? So I did, went to Chicago, and his son, Jarrett, was a freshman at the University of Miami. And so I moved into Jarrett's bedroom and had a chance to be there with Walter and the family for those next 10 weeks, off and on. It's funny. They have this saying in sports, you should never really meet your heroes because they'll always let you down, right? That people are much better in your imagination than they will ever be once you get a chance to truly interact. Walter totally broke that model for me, because he was even greater the better I got to know him.
Was there one lesson that you took away, like when you walked away from that experience? Is there anything he taught you that you thought, man, that was a life lesson I'm never going to forget?
Well, one day, I applied the lesson my father had taught me: ask a question. And so I asked the question, Walter, if you had to think of something that you think will be made you better or special. And he said, you know what, yeah. And he actually shared with me that he had been reading an article many years earlier, 20 years earlier, and there was a quote there, and it was ironically from John Wooden. And the quote was, you cannot live a perfect day without doing something for someone who cannot repay you.
Wow.
You can't live a perfect day without doing something for someone who could never pay you back. And he said, I made that my job every day from that moment on, last 20 years of my life, to do something every day that couldn't be repaid to someone whose life might be altered as a result of my action. And he said, when I made that my commitment, I'm going to tell you, my life got better. And this is a guy who was the greatest running back of all time. But it was it wasn't physical. It was a willingness to be a servant to others that he would argue made him special.
Wow. And that's actually, later on we're going to talk about the 10 pillars of leadership, and serving and teaching is one of those 10 pillars, because, matter of fact, our CEO, and you may not know this, but when he introduces himself, he talks about himself as a servant CEO, which is probably odd to, people from other companies, because you don't hear about CEOs talking about it that way. But he wants everyone to know that no matter what your leadership position is, your number one goal, your number one job is to serve others any way that you can to make their life better, to make their experience, better, to help them succeed. And that's really what being a leader is all about. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
Is there anybody today, like when you look at the sports world today, is there anybody you look at and you're like, wow, this person just really impresses me today?
Yeah, I have to tell you, it's funny. I'm a tennis fan. Like, I'm not a great tennis player, but I love watching excellence, sustained excellence. And Roger Federer just absolutely has been at the top of my list for years. I don't think he'll ever do a book, right? The kind of book that I would hope he would one day do. But Roger is that guy that, to me, I marvel. You can't tell if he's winning or losing by watching him, because he makes sure that his presence and what he exudes is a belief that he is rightfully there, and he's going to do his best. You're going to get his best, and don't ever count me out. Like, you may be up 2-0 on me, but you better be ready, because earning that third set's going to be hard.
Right.
And I don't know him well, only have interviewed him a few times. I know him through other relationships, and he's just so highly, like, he is that one. He's like that bucket list person
right.
that you always have out there that you'd love to work with.
Right.
He is the bucket.
Well, it's interesting, because there's so many themes around leadership that just keeps coming back around. But you talk about consistency, use that word,
right.
Consistency. Another one of the pillars of leadership is consistency.
Yes.
I first learned that from John Maxwell, leading the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership. But consistency, and actually later today on the leadership convention, Brian Carruthers, who's our number one income earner, is going to talk about consistency.
Brian's a star.
And it's amazing when you talk about the best, that word consistent always comes up. No matter what's going on, you can always count on it. You know where they're going to be. And talking with my mentors and others, it's like, hey, when things are going really great, don't get too high. Don't get too full of yourself a little bit. Things are going great, but keep an even keel. But when things are going down, also don't get too low. Stay consistent and just know where you're going and pledge forward.
By the way, so one of my favorite, I know you love John Maxwell as I do,
Yep.
right? And one of my favorite parts of the whole Maxwell lesson plan is that he wrote that book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, right?
Yeah.
Then when he was asked to revise it as by his publisher years later, when he actually came back and he rewrote about 70% of it, and including changing a law, because as irrefutable as they were when he first wrote it, sometimes things change. So yes, it's important to be consistent, to constantly push yourself. It's also important to adjust as you continue as circumstances continue to require that of you.
That's important. Yeah, plan, do, adjust.
Right.
Get back and get back. Review your plan, and things happen. When you do things, you learn. That's why the greatest coaches, and you can probably comment on this, the greatest coaches are the ones not with the greatest plan going into the game, but the ones that go into halftime and make the adjustments.
Man, I have to tell you, and one of my favorite statistics. I love basketball, right? I love all sports, but I love basketball. One of my favorite statistics that is actually tracked by the NBA are what happens to a team after a timeout. Like, do they score? Do they, points after timeout, right? And that's a reference point to, is the leader able to use that moment, right, to design something that the team can go out and execute on.
Right.
And so they actually measure it in the NBA. It's not a statistic that everybody follows. It's one of my favorites because it tells you who leads, right? Not just the people with the best talent. It's the people who know how to take the talent they have and do the best with that talent. And that's where, making adjustments is really key.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this question, because one of the things we have at Legal Shield right now, which is a great thing, is we have a lot of new leaders. 2020 has been an incredible year. We've had a lot of leadership growth, a lot of people that are personally achieving great things, but they're also just starting to build teams. We have a rank in Legal Shield called Future Leaders of Legal Shield, which is just at the beginning. You're just starting to be a leader. You might have a team of 4 or 5 people. You're building it to 10 or 15. Obviously, your goal is to get it to hundreds and thousands. But what do you say to new leaders who are just going from maybe being an individual contributor to really starting to lead even a small team, but they want to, get into leading bigger teams?
Sure. 2 things I'd tell you. The first is to understand that that the most important person you're going to lead, and this is true whether you're a new leader or CEO, is yourself, right? That you can't say that it's extraordinarily important to be on time for meetings and then to be consistently late. You can't say it's important to treat other people with respect and then be consistently disrespectful. Your words will mean nothing if you're not leading yourself well. Lead yourself as you expect them to see a leader, the leader that you want them to follow. But secondly, as a new leader, the first thing I would do is I would go interview other people. I'd go ask questions of the team you have, maybe of a couple people who have chosen no longer to be on the team that you have, or have chosen maybe to go do something else. Try to understand what's the cultural dynamic, but don't jump in with, here's my plan, I've got these great ideas, because to change everything from the previous guy who was clearly a bum or whatever it might be. You want to come in with this idea of, I'm here to learn first and then lead off of that learning. So be open to conversation, be a great communicator, but understand the most important communication will come from your actions. That's where people will see who you are as a leader.
Absolutely. In Legal Shield, that translates into being in Performance Club. And Performance Club is what we have at Legal Shield to say, hey, just do a little bit, but do it consistently every month. And we have a leaderboard where people can see you're either in Performance Club or you're not in Performance Club. And your team looks at that and they go, wait a minute, you're telling me to be in Performance Club, but I don't see your name on the list being in Performance Club. And we have another term in Legal Shield we call our MAD streak. Now, not because we're upset all the time, it's because MAD stands for making a difference. Because every time we empower someone with the membership,
Right.
Every time we bring on a new business partner to join us in the business, we're making a difference in their life. And so our Mad Streak just simply says, do something every month. Lead by example, whether it's enrolling a new member, because a lot of associates are part-time, or recruiting a new associate, but your team sees that.
Right.
And they say you're either consistently doing something or you're not. And so too many times, and you probably have noticed this too, I see leaders who are kind of hot and cold. Like they're either all in or they're all out. 3 months, they're like, we got to do this, and this. And then for 3 months, you don't see them. And then all of a sudden they wake back up and like, oh, we got to do this, and this. And it's hard to lead from not being consistent all the time.
Right. And that's where they're going to get their greatest message from you will come from your actions.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. We have a lot of great leaders in Legal Shield. We're bordering on a 49-year-old company. We're going to celebrate our 50th anniversary as a company next year. We were founded in 1972, so about a year and a half from now, in 2022, we're going to celebrate our 50th year anniversary. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of leaders been around for 20 years, 25 years, and they've done a lot of great things. But what would you say to some really established leaders in Legal Shield that have large teams on how they can continue their leadership growth, but any advice you have on continuing to lead even after you've been a leader for a long time?
So this gets to the Federer fascination, or the interest in sustained excellence, right? And so that's the discussion that I enjoy most having. And when I'm looking for people that I want to define as great, or teams that are great, it's not just the opportunity to occasionally be good. It's an annual behavior that you're going to find yourself. The most important thing you have to do there is remember that the past is the past, right? That I once had a coach say that too many others spend too much time sleeping in their trophy room, right? They spend too much time appreciating themselves for what they've achieved in years past.
Yeah.
Those are all in the rearview mirror, baby. The key is don't spend, and recognize that each year, each opportunity is a new. You should see it anew. And that's what each of those leaders, if you've been there 25 years, I hope that year 26 will be greater, but not be, and maybe the experience will be valuable, but it's not going to be because you're in coast mode, right? You are recognizing what you've done in the past is the past, what we're going to do in the future. Hey, if you'd have come into 2020 planning on doing everything you did in 2016, by the way, not a workable environment, right? In 2020, you have to be ready to pivot and adjust.
Absolutely. I reminded earlier you were talking about taking that time out and be willing to adjust, and I think back to our international convention in April. Here we are, mid-March, and the pandemic hits. Nobody saw that. The world changes. We've got 5,000-6,000 people supposed to be in Dallas, Texas for an international convention. And, Jeff Bell, who's our coach, kind of gathers us all together, gives us that little 2-minute timeout and says, we got to pivot here, 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 and here. And we all go out and execute. And you talk about what does it look like coming out of the timeout? Well, what it looked like coming out of the timeout was an international convention with even more people, 10,000 people live streamed all across North America. And from that point forward, things just went up and to the right in the field because we've adapted and changed, and I think that you're talking about that. It's so important to do that.
It is. I mean, I think those who are constantly in that mode. I mean, I look at Nick Saban. Like, that's what fascinates me about Nick Saban. I get a chance to work with his team at Alabama about every other year. They bring me in to speak to the team. And in those conversations that I get with Coach Saban while I'm there, you're always, the guy's 70 years old or near. I mean, how does he continue to do this? And the reason is because he sees each year as an independent opportunity. And I want to be able at the end of the year to judge myself, say that I did my very best to plan well, execute well, review well. And what he did last year or 3 years ago, or That's all. Those are, in fact, the past.
That's awesome. You talked about your bucket list was Roger Federer.
Right.
My bucket list was meeting John Maxwell. Because here's a gentleman I had studied for 20 years, and people had studied the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership with my team, and so I didn't get it. I thought I was going to really do well when I heard that he was a speaker at the Fall Leadership Convention a few years back. I'm sitting in the front row taking notes. I didn't think I'd get a chance to meet him in person, but when I got to spend 3 days with him again, here's a person that you hope that is everything you hope he would be when you meet him in person. And he was even better in person than what I imagined he would be just reading the books, and kind of the same experience that you had. But what you just said reminded me of one of the most important things I remember sitting there listening to John Maxwell. He's sitting there talking, and I was sitting next to Darnell Self. And sometimes as a leader, when you're having a lot of success, you can feel pretty good about yourself. And I'm sitting there, and I'm taking lots of notes, and he says, if the stories you're telling are more than 6 months old, you're a has-been. And that was like a punch in the gut. And the reason it was like a punch in the gut, and my oldest son, Matthew, is I had just been talking to Matthew the week before, and I was telling him all these great stories, but they were all from 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago. We used to do this, and I remember we used to do this, and all this, so forth. And here's John Maxwell saying, if your stories are more than 6 months old, you're a has-been. And it really, and he said, hey, that might be a punch in the gut to some people, but I wrote that down, I circled it, because I said, I want my next stories to be from this week. I want my next stories to be from last month. I want to be telling stories, because that's how you're a relevant leader, is to be telling stories about what you're doing now, not, like as you said, sleeping in your trophy room.
Right.
And so when you're telling that, it just reminded me of that story that John told.
Wow. Well, I have to tell you, John is, I know a mentor. You've been a mentor to me. I love going down and just getting some time with him, because he, a lot of leaders talk the talk. Sometimes their video track and their audio track don't really align, right? And that's not true with John. One of the things that he says often is, be a river, not a reservoir, right? Give, don't just collect. And I remember the very first time I went and did any work with him, you're thinking, gosh, okay, there's all these executives around here. Many of them probably could use I'd like to think they could use some of my content in their teaching or their work with their teams. But is it appropriate? I'm at his event with his clients, and I'm being paid by him to be there. What if one of them says, I'd like to do something with you? So I asked him, I said, do I need to pay you part of it? What do I need to do? And he goes, no, Don, when I say I want to be a river and not a reservoir, this is what I mean. I want to open up opportunities for people, my friends, to meet more of my friends, so that everybody around benefits. Be a river, not a reservoir. It's a great leadership tactic.
Absolutely. Well, you and I built a friendship because of that.
Absolutely.
We met at an event that he invited both of us to, and through that event, things took off from there. So let me ask you this question, because I think this is going to be very valuable to a lot of people in Legal Shield. A few days ago, we had you speak to our next level leaders.
Yes.
So this is a group of leaders in Legal Shield that we've assembled based on what they've done. I mean, you can't say, I just want to be a next level leader. It's based on, you have done the work to prove that you are the next generation of leaders in Legal Shield. And we had about 85 leaders on that Zoom. And you spent an hour talking about storytelling. And in Legal Shield, I've said probably 1,000 times that facts tell and stories sell. People don't want to hear bedtime facts; they want to hear bedtime stories. That's what really just attracts people. If you want to get someone's attention, and we talk about in Legal Shield, we say testimonial. You got to know what your 30-second testimonial is, your 1-minute testimonial. When you meet a stranger or you meet someone through, like you said, maybe it's one of those situations where through a mutual acquaintance you meet someone. What's your 1 minute that's going to get them to say, this person's interesting, I want to know more about them, I want to know more about their business or this membership. And you talked about 2 big mistakes that a lot of people make in telling their story. And so since having your story in Legal Shield is so important, I thought maybe you could share that with everyone today. What have you learned about storytelling, and what are those two major mistakes that you see people make around storytelling?
Well, the two are, for me, most people, when they're trying to figure out, they know they might be meeting with a prospect or someone that they would hope what they might add to their team or wherever it might be, right? They don't know their audience well enough, right? Which might mean, let's say I know that I'm meeting today with Don Thompson, right? And if I know that, and I know that he's got a son at Florida State and a son at Notre Dame, and he, he loves college sports, and he's this. The more I know about you, the better I'll be at being able to choose what it is I want to talk to you about, or the story I might want to share with you, right? If I can share with you a story that you and I can find ourselves in together, right? The better story it's going to be, and the more connection's going to grow from it. So the first part is we don't often know enough about who our audience is going to be. Now, if this is an elevator speech, part of it comes down to look at people. Like, you might see something, you might see a lapel pin that will tell you, whatever it might be, look for something that tells you more about your audience so that you can find the right story to say the right words. The second miss is that most people don't know how to bring a call to action into play, right? How do you take the sharing of your story, the connection that's occurring because you're in relationship here, and how do you bring it in for a landing, right? To try to get people to do something. And that's because they don't know what the landing should look like, right? We don't know what we really want from them. We think it's that we want them to be on our team. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe. So understanding the front end and the back end of I call them the bookshelf of great storytelling. The bookends are what you have to focus on. If you don't have those down, it's hard to tell a great story.
Yes, it's so true, because I know when I have to sit down, and if I'm going to be giving a speech at a convention, the first things I think about are how am I going to open and how am I going to close.
Right.
The middle sometimes writes itself depending on the topic, but what can I say at the beginning to capture people's attention so they go, I want to listen to this? And then at the end, what am I trying to lead people to? Is it an emotion? Is it a feeling? Is it, like you said, a call to action to go do something? Because you want to make sure you know exactly what you're going to say at the end that's going to take what you did and then transfer it to that action.
Right. Because sometimes it is an action, like I want you to do, or sometimes it's I want you to think, or in that next time when you're affected this way, here's what I hope you'll remember, right? So whatever it is, knowing those things. I mean, what was one of the things you said to me right before we began recording today? You told me about it, about the group that will be watching this video, to make sure I understood the difference between what they generally expect from people that you ask to present to them, and maybe other audiences that I might typically be in front of. You wanted me to, the more I know, the better I am, the better I'll be, the better storyteller I will become.
Absolutely. To me, the greatest storyteller in Legal Shield ever, and a gentleman, unfortunately, you never got a chance to meet, but his name was Dave Savola. A lot of people that are watching today know Dave. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he was the #1 income earner in the history of Legal Shield. And nobody could immediately, he could meet a stranger and within 30 to 60 seconds tell you their life story, because he was genuinely interested in other people. And he was a sports fanatic. You would have loved him. And but he was a big Ohio State guy, and he would from Mogador, Ohio. But he could talk to you in an elevator on the first floor. And by the time you got to the 11th floor, he would know where you're from, what you do, where your family's from, how many kids you have, things like that. Because before he could talk to you about the opportunity and how the opportunity was right for you, he wanted to know everything he could about you.
Exactly. My wife, it drives her nuts. She actually says to me, we'll get out of a taxi cab in New York, and she'll go, did you really need to know how that guy found his way to America? Or whatever it is. Do you ever give people a break? And I'm like, no, I genuinely want to know. And it's just, again, what's your interest level in others? The more you know, the better you'll be.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the thing that originally really drew me to you, I put in my notes, like, I've got to get Don to speak at one of our conventions, was the storytelling. And so I appreciate you talking about that. And we could go on probably for hours just talking about stories. And I know you have so many great stories. A lot of the stories that you have are in your newest book. The book on greatness, the 16 characteristics of true champions. And as you read that book, it's such a quick read because it's just full of stories. And so I love, everyone loves stories, and it's one story after another about people that they recognize. Maybe they don't know the whole story behind that person, and digging in. That's why people love autobiographies and biographies, because they want to know more about those people and what really drove them. But how did you accumulate the information for this latest book? And really, what was the driving force that you said, I have to deliver this book? Everyone needs to know, what are these characteristics behind greatness?
As I shared, when I was leaving Sports Illustrated and I was going into the speaking world, I did that exercise where I tried to pull together what were the lessons that came up, what were the most consistent. I found these 16 showed up most often, but what I realized was that in most keynote opportunities, I could cover 3. Maybe if the day was right, I might be able to get in 4 in an hour. Right. But I wanted people to be able to understand something from each one of the 16 of the most important characteristics that the truly great ones claim played their role in their achievement. But what stood out to me was that you could tell them all a great story, and that would be good, but then you want to make sure the story leads to a lesson, and the lesson leads to an opportunity to go do something with it. So that became kind of the story, lesson, application. And if we could do that in each chapter with each one of these characteristics, the hour that I had with your team earlier was 3 of those characteristics. All 16 are covered here in this book.
That's awesome. And I love like I said, the book is, when I say quick read, that's not to say the content isn't rich.
No, I don't use big words. But let's be honest. Yeah, I'm a sports guy. Yeah. I don't use big words.
But I love the stories. The stories tell a lesson. Sometimes people say things in language I don't relate to, and I'm going, I think they said this, but I'm not sure what they just said. But when I read those lessons in this book, I'm just like, I get that. Like, I can apply that immediately to my life, because as I read, John Maxwell talks about using ACT, apply, change, train. Right. What is something I can apply to my business? What is something I can change about myself or my business? And what is something that I can train my team? So as you go through those characteristics, you need to ask each of those characteristics, ask yourself, is this something I can apply to myself? Like, maybe I'm not doing this as well as I should be, right. But then I can also change it. That's a C. Like, you either say, yes, I'm applying that, or I should apply that, but then, you know what, I need to be a bigger giver. These people think more about others before they think about themselves. Or, one that I know I could relate to is the first one, which is champions, hate to lose more than they like to win. And oh my gosh, that's so true. Like, I love winning, but I hate to lose. And I hate to lose more than
man. If I lose, I stew. And my wife's like, Don, you're playing in like a city league basketball game. Really? Do you really? It's not going to change your life. You're not going to earn $1 more for winning or losing. I know, but it's how you're wired.
You could go back to even high school and think about all the games you win. It's hard to remember some of those games, but if you lost by one move at the end of a wrestling match or something like that, and somebody took that from you, you still remember that.
Right.
And it goes back to some of those famous quotes about people may not remember what you did, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Exactly.
Losing makes you feel a certain way that you don't want to feel again.